As you can see, we're not going to be using the PowerPoint. We've decided to keep this as a conversation session. So there's no mics, but it's great because the room's small and there's a small number of us, so I think it'll work. Just quickly, before we start, I think it would be great to just get a sense of who's in the room. So just introduce yourself, maybe your affiliation, and why you're here, because there's not many of us. So you can start with whoever's brave enough.
Joseph.
Yeah, I'll start. My name is Joseph. I'm an economics honors student at UCT.
I'm Chloe, and I'm on the VITS Rethinking Economics for Africa team. And I am an economics student, but I'm considering going into city planning.
I'm Sarah, and I'm an architecture student, and I don't really know much about economics, but I'm here to learn.
I'm Harriet. I'm an undergrad economics student at UCT.
I'm Dr. Juvela from Nelson Mandela.
My name is Alice Kanengo, and I work with the Open Society Foundations.
Luca Nunier, a girlfriend who's writing a master's in spatial justice.
Hi, my name is Nteba, and I'm from Social Justice Coalition.
Hi everyone, I'm Siba and I'm from Education.
I'm Alia, I'm an economics student at UCT.
Hi, I'm Lindo, behavioral economist doing a PhD at UCT.
I'm Catherine, I am a lecturer in the economics department at UCT.
I'm Sponello, I have a housing background, studied at KZN, and I hold a master's in urban studies, and I work as a researcher in a center called the Urban Future Center, which does urban research and socio-economic stuff.
My name is Lens. I am doing my master in University in the Department of Economics.
Hi, I'm Togia. I'm a student at INW. I'm studying urban and regional planning.
I'm Kateko, journalist for the Daily Mail. From the Conversation Africa.
And we should introduce ourselves too. I'm Sarita Pillay. I'm currently doing my PhD in urban planning here at WITS, but worked in the land and housing advocacy space for a bit.
My name is Mandy Sayaki. I work for an organization called the Social Justice Coalition, and we work on issues of spatial justice.
I'm Sean Butcher. I'm a lecturer here at WITS in human geography, perhaps an odd one out amongst the economists of the planet. And my research is around so-called affordable suburbanization, bonded housing development by private developers, particularly in the Gauteng region, and I'm particularly interested in the sort of supply-side dynamics of that.
Okay, so thank you for joining us today. I think firstly just to say it's quite refreshing to have a panel talking about land with women on the panel. It's been interesting to see how the land debate and public discourse has been captured by certain voices, so we need to be constantly aware of that. But thank you for joining us. I think what we've decided to do today is to keep it as a conversation. We're all coming from various different backgrounds, different experiences of research, of activism, of both. And we also know that in the room we have economists, which none of us are, and people who are aspiring to work in the planning space, in the housing space, who are activists themselves. So we have a lot to draw on in this room. So we're going to first keep this as a conversation between those of us here, but also ask you to please engage. So I think firstly, we know that this discussion is about land and housing markets and the question of spatial justice, so the fight for spatial justice. So I think as a starting point, it would be good to hear from Sean and Mandisa, your thoughts about where we are right now. So what are we seeing in our cities? What is happening right now when it comes to land and housing? Mandisa.
Okay, so that's an interesting question, and I like it because I think it allows us to look at what we see, but also how we ended up with what we see. And I think that's where I want to sort of start, and to say that so we understand the history of South Africa and how our cities were planned under apartheid, and how that system sought to actively exclude certain races in the country. And so we know that as a result of apartheid, and I mean, if we think about apartheid and colonialism and all the injustices and the policies we've seen before that, we know that these, as much as they were political systems, they were also economic systems, in the sense that they sought to advantage a particular race and a particular class in the country. And that meant a majority of South African citizens were excluded from economic benefits, and the economic benefits that cities in particular had to offer. And so we find ourselves with a situation where we have what we call townships. And we know that townships were built to supply cheap labor to the capitalist apartheid system of the time, to sustain a system that disadvantaged black communities and advantaged white communities. And how that has resulted in what we see now as race and class having had to align so neatly in South Africa. And I don't think anywhere else in the world we see this neat relationship and alignment between class and race, where you know that you are in the township, you are either black or colored, and you have no real ownership of the city. And how that foundation of apartheid and city planning or spatial planning of the time, how we continue to see that today, and how we continue to have places that are still called townships, where people are still fighting over space, where people are still fighting for ownership of the city, where millions of South Africans still do not have ownership of the land in the city. Because if you look at townships and how those spaces are set up, you can't really say you own land. Because even when you have a house in a township, it's not really a house. And it's not really a space that you can call home. I mean, we can talk about layers of how problematic townships are. We talk about safety for women and children. We can talk about safety for everyone. We can talk about access to basic services like sanitation, like water, like electricity, and how the inaccessibility of all those things speak to who owns land in the city or who owns the city, and how cities are hubs of economic growth and are places where the economy, whatever that means, happens. And how by virtue of staying in a township, you are excluded from that. And add to that the poor public transport system. And how expensive that is. And if you stay in Cape Town and you stay in Khayelitsha and you work in the city center, you spend about 50 to 60 rand a day trying to go to work or school. And you spend about 2 hours of your day trying to go to work or go back home. And that speaks to the ownership of the land or urban land. And the question of ownership speaks to the question of justice. How just is that? How just is that set up? I think maybe when we talk later and think about what that means and how we move forward and how we try to solve those vast problems, maybe we can talk about how cities are planned and whether that has changed from when cities were planned to exclude black poor people, and whether that has changed now that we are saying we are in a democratic South Africa, and what that means for black poor women specifically. And I would like us to sort of think along those lines.
Okay. I think just a kind of a follow-up question to that. So we see the kind of historical legacies of what's happening today reflecting entrenched spatial apartheid, right? But there's also things that are actively happening, that are being done. And I'm just thinking recently I saw that SJC is involved in some eviction cases. So do you just want to kind of explain what that is?
So the SJC works on, like I said, on issues of spatial justice. And how we've sort of framed that has been in like two strands of work, really. Looking at service delivery in informal settlements, and we focused on sanitation for the longest time. And we've engaged the city of Cape Town in that. And another aspect of that is safety and justice for marginalized communities. And that still focuses on informal settlements and townships. And what our sanitation work and our work on informal settlements and how those can be upgraded and integrated into the city, we've sort of naturally landed on issues of land and urban land justice and what that means. What we've seen, because of the work that we do, because we organize and mobilize in these communities, and because, I mean, the question of land has always been an important one, but because there's 2019 coming up, right? Everyone is talking about land. We're talking about expropriation. Whether that is going to happen is another question. But so there's this buzz around the land question, and everyone, because everyone has always wanted access to land. Now people are beginning to identify pockets of land that are unoccupied. People are occupying those spaces or those pieces of land. What we've seen from the city of Cape Town, and not just limited to that, but what we've seen across the country, is how the government has dealt with people that occupied land with so much violence. I mean, we can take the example of Abahlali Basemjondolo in Durban and in Tier in Gauteng, and how they have been experiencing shocking levels of violence, not only from private property owners, and maybe not from private property owners at all, but from the government itself. I've seen people being killed, how I've seen people being violated by state agencies for occupying land. And in Khayelitsha, a group of people came together and occupied a piece of land in Makaza, a township in Khayelitsha. And these people have been evicted, and we've seen these evictions popping up across Cape Town. As an organization working in these things, naturally we've had to respond to that, to say, what does it mean? How do we engage with such? Because, I mean, for the longest time, people have been waiting for houses, people have been waiting for services, and now that there's this buzz around land and people have been seeing these open pieces of land, people have decided to occupy, because people have a right to belong in the city, people have a right to belong in this country. But what seems to be the problem is how there's no engagement from the government in trying to address that, because so the argument is always that this is private-owned land, you can't occupy this, and because it's owned by a private person who we never ever meet. But there's no engagement to say, so how do we solve your housing problem? How do we solve the fact that you don't have a place to stay now? Because if we come in and evict you, where are we saying you should go stay? And most victims of these violent evictions have been women. some of the women we've spoken to are women that have run away from abusive marriages and abusive relationships and decided that I'm going to go build a shack for myself and my children because it's better to stay here than to stay in a 4-bedroomed house where I might die any minute. And we've seen the anti-land invasion unit coming in and demolishing people's houses. And I mean, what has been a point of debate and contention has been what it means or what constitutes a home. And whose standard do we use to say this structure doesn't qualify as a home? Because what the state in the form of the city of Cape Town has been saying is that no, we are not demolishing people's homes. We are not evicting people. We are just demolishing unoccupied structures. Yes. And so the question is, who determines what a home is in the urban space? If I build a structure and I've run away from my abusive husband, or I could not afford rent anymore at the backyard of some person, and I decided that I'm going to join this group of people that is occupying this piece of land, and I have like very basic things like a mattress and a few dishes and things. And if people come in and decide that this doesn't qualify as a home, can people destroy my home because it doesn't fit their own standards of a home? And that is not defined anyway. Not even law defines what a home is. So there's a policy or an ad called PI, which is, I always get it wrong, the protection of protection against illegal evictions and unlawful occupations. Yeah, and not even that defines what a home is. And that's where our struggle with the city of Cape Town right now, and we are in court trying to establish these things to say. So, because you're a middle class advantaged person, do you get to define what should be a home for me as a person, as a poor working class person who cannot afford to buy a bed or to have a stove or whatever it is that you think defines a home? So that's where we are to say, what is it? And if this case goes forward and we win it, hopefully, it's not looking very good right now. But what we're seeking to answer is, what is a home and who determines and defines what a home should look like?
Thanks, Mandisa. I think that there's a lot of insight there that we can draw from. Just about the continuing spatial violence. I know that's a term that's used quite loosely, but I think we can understand how this works both in terms of what you're saying of the continued spatial geography, how that means that a mother is traveling 4 hours a day to get to work, to come back. I think a recent study in the city of Cape Town showed that your average working class person spends 40% of their monthly income on transport, just on transport. And then there's the spatial violence that we're seeing through private property rights being defended by actors like the anti-land invasion units and brutal policing that's breaking down people's homes and injuring and even killing people in some instances. So that's our current reality. Sean, I think this is also, you've done a bit of research on affordable housing, the idea of affordable housing and the land markets in South Africa in terms of affordable housing. What is the current state of housing and land markets in South Africa? How can we characterize that? Reflecting on the spatial violence, what are we seeing right now?
Thanks, Mandisa and Sarita. I'm just struck by how I want to come back to this question of home when we're talking about where to next. So let's hold on to that. And it's not something I think about in my own work, so if you can push me in that way. So in terms of land markets, housing markets, really structured not only by obdurate apartheid legacies in the racialized ways that Vandisa was talking about, but also how that articulates with capitalist land markets. So for me, in my work, this has really structured making sense of these dynamics where all space is urban space is ostensibly commodified, even though people are pushing back against that through the kinds of occupations you're talking about, but in a setting where there is an assumption that markets are efficient, competitive, and that our land and housing are distributed through some sort of natural dynamics of supply and demand that are all guided by the logic of land development under capitalism, which is to the highest and best use, right? And within that, always the protection of property value, the mandate to not mix values and uses that would disturb property value. And there we see that, really manifest in where a lot of our public housing sits on the peripheries of our cities, so as not to disturb those dynamics. And also, it's an imagination of a land and property market in which the state is just facilitating these, efficient forces of supply and demand. And we see how this is, deeply normalized in how we think about these things, how the operations of the anti-eviction, anti-land, anti-land invasion unit kind of justifies their operations, right? But we also see how households themselves have become deeply invested in maintaining property value. For example, you'll hear in the media on the edges of neighborhoods in Protea Glen, for example, homeowners battling to keep informal settlements at bay to protect that property value in which they have sank so much debt and investment, right? So this is not only operating at this kind of systemic level, but we as aspirational middle-class property owners have to buy into this too, right? So at the same time, the state is really invested in business as usual, investing in the same old cause, Santon being the kind of exemplar case of where investment goes. And this is all about kind of agglomeration economics, right? So we just keep putting money into those already successful places with an imagination that this will create growth to trickle down to elsewheres and could ostensibly be used to cross-subsidize other places, but whether that happens or not is another matter. And the state is also deeply invested in this kind of agglomeration economics vis-a-vis construction jobs. So the Mall of Africa, for example, province was hugely behind all of that development for precisely the jobs it was supposed to create for deep root residents. Also for property tax revenues, so raising land values to capture that for the state. And again, that means just investing in the same old places, right, rather than kind of redistributing that across the urban landscape. Others would say that actually the state's been far too active in the land market. So a lot of developers that I chat to are like, no, there's far too much regulation. This is what's kind of slowing change in property markets. And more critical institutionalist approaches, I think, would say that we have to take seriously the state as a market actor itself that is obviously shaping how these markets work. And I have seen in my own work how planning processes tend to favor the largest landowners, the largest developers, those that have the money to sit through 8-year processes of land development, for example. So again, we see the tendency towards consolidation and monopolization that we do in many sectors, like the food sector, construction. So those are some of the more traditional kind of economics arguments for why we see what we see. I think here it's useful to revisit some Marxist theories of capitalist land markets and urban development. I don't know if I can talk to those now or...
I think let's hold on that for a second. I think it's worthwhile reflecting on the why for a bit. So we see what we see. We have an assessment of how kind of orthodox or mainstream approaches, economic approaches, justify or explain what we're seeing. And I think it's interesting too to understand that this isn't just a logic or an ideological position that's being that's shared by actors within real estate who we conventionally think as property developers, but this is something that state actors are going along with too. I mean, Mandisa mentioned about the land invasion unit, this question of the Mall of Africa or investment in Sandton being seen as a way to grow the economy. I think the question is why? You know, why is this being bought into? I mean, I think at this point it's maybe a good idea to hear from you all your thoughts on that particular question. Do we have ideas around land where land is not commodified? Do we have a limited imagination? Is it, you know, I'd just be interested to hear from the people sitting amongst us today. I mean, no one knows the answers completely, but we have ideas. Anyone?
I'm not sure what the question.
So I think the question is, why do we think this logic seems to dominate, the idea that land is a commodity, whereas we can hear that there is a strong call for land to be used for its social use.
I mean, this is very basic, but a lot of the time the argument hinges on the protection of property rights, in my experience. And there's really this like slippery slope mentality that people have, where they think that essentially to appease like investors, which I think we've understood widely that the government is largely in their pockets, they have to really put on a show that property rights are like completely protected and prioritized, as opposed to the needs of citizens. Yeah, so there is that dynamic, especially in like a globalizing world. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it largely goes back to really the birth of liberalism and colonialism. The fact that, you know, your John Locke and others envisioned property rights as a natural right, more than anything else, which was what brought to, you know, this continent. You know, if you go to villages and traditional societies, which still has remnants of how they used to organize society, what you do is, if you want to start a family, for example, if you have read Things Fall Apart, Chinua Achebe, it tries to draw you know, a picture of how things were before the interruption of colonialism. Well, if you want to start a family, you go to the chief and the elder and say, hey, this is me, and I have a wife here, and then they're like, okay, we'll give you this land for you to use to bring up your family. But that land doesn't belong to you, it still belongs to the community. It does not even belong to the chief, it belongs to the community, so that when you are done and you've done whatever, you've lived up your 60-year life, you know, it gets given to someone else who needs it. And if the community now decides, you know, on your piece of land, you want to grow crops because there's a, you know, a famine or something, you know, you are relocated and moved to somewhere else. No one owned a piece of land and it was them, and, you know, forever. It was, you know, used as what do we need and how do we divide what we need, you know. So now liberalism, obviously, it's, you know, the ideology of the world because of colonialism. To change that, would really need a lot, which was what the Soviets and all of these guys were trying to do before it collapsed. So I mean, if you want to now remove value from property, you are fighting a bigger system out there. Yeah. And I have no idea how you can do that.
Yeah, I wanted to build on that because I think it also has a lot to do for me with just the idea of justiciability of socio-economic rights as opposed to your classic human rights. And property rights is one of those. And it's quite easy for somebody to say, I have title deeds to this piece of land, and so I have a right to ownership of that land. Like Mandisa rightly says, it's quite fluid when it comes to the right to housing, for instance. What kind of housing, what size of housing, and who determines that. So there's a whole debate around just how justiciable are socio-economic rights. And I think that's one of the key questions we ought to be talking about, because if we don't address that, it will remain very fluid. And even if somebody was to claim the right to housing from government will say, yes, it's your constitutional right. But if you take it to the law, and I'm actually curious to hear from the work that Mandisa is doing, what their experience has been working through the courts and trying to get justice through the courts in terms of socio-economic rights.
I think something that I think maybe we don't always think about when we have a discussion about land and ownership is the other parts that come along with land. And I've seen this being a challenging factor in a number of cases. So one of the big issues is water rights. And we treat water rights and land rights differently. And what that means is that when a person has land, they don't have water to commercialize. It's commercialized all for development purposes or whatever you want to use it for. And the governance that we use to manage both of these stem differently. And I think we also see it in the mining space, and that's why we have some of the challenges we have. And touching on the gentleman's previous point, I think in South Africa, and it's not unique to South Africa, we're struggling with this tension between traditional land ownership and individual, the dominant form of land ownership, or the market ownership, right? And I think other countries like India, Brazil, have gone through this process, and I think there's this tension that exists between traditional ownership and commercial ownership needs to be questioned. And I think in finding the balance between the two, we might be able to look at what is the social system. And I think we in South Africa, as much as we have a lot of issues with traditional authorities, I think there's a few, and I'm happy to mention, like for instance, Robert Game, which has a lot of problems of its own, but it stands out as the model traditional authority in the country at the moment because of what it's been able to do. But even they are questioning, are they able to do enough for their people? And I think we need to, if we start interrogating some of these systems that exist and asking ourselves, how can we make them work better? It might be the model that we can use in other instances, because the current commercial system doesn't work for everybody. And I think we also need to embrace our Africanism around the way we thought about governance before this, and to maybe look at alternatives.
There was one more. We'll take one more hand. Yes.
Yeah. What I'd like to say is just two things. That it is clear that there is a discrepancy between customary laws and national laws. That is quite clear, because once again, if you look in terms of housing, a same woman who has rights to their house, their house is the property, they have ownership over it. When their husband dies, they have, but then when it comes to customary laws, it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the brothers in the family, together with some of the assets. And sometimes for the sake of peace, some women offer to let it die down. And to me, that is quite key, because women are the ones that cultivate the land, never mind how they went to cultivate, because it's also quite serious that when in the olden days when when they went to cultivate the land, the women would be expected to carry the tools, as primitive as they are, and also carry the baby at the back. What would a man carry? Just a stick and a jacket, you know, and then they would expect the women to provide lunch. So we've got to see how we break these traditional barriers, because the women are, you know, look at the co-ops, whether in the urban area or in the, it's still many of those are women. And so women, you know, have those primitive tools to actually cultivate the land, but it's just a matter of access. Once again, if I look at them, the young people, and I want to find out from the young people in the house, are they ready to use the land? Are they ready to make the, you know, to make something out of the land? Are they ready to live out of the land? If for an example, the young people here would be given a farm, would they be ready to do, you know? So we need a little bit of educational background on some of small things. How do you grow a garden? No, young people don't want to grow vegetables. I'm just making an example. You know, what do they do during the day if they are in their own house? You see young men watching TV the whole day, whereas there's a gardener that's activating something, no matter how small it is. So we need to check out the readiness also of young, because that is where, you know, something, you know, you can get a lot of employment out of that. But have ever young people looked at how they can, you know, use the land to actually, you know, if they were given the land, would they do it themselves, or they would employ other people to do it for them?
Thank you. So I would encourage those of us who are thinking about the tension between customary land rights to actually consider watching this land. I think it's actually happening today at 11:15. I think we need to be wary of over-valorizing customary land rights. There's a lot of tension at the moment between how it's also being used as a form of elite capture of land. So how do you? So there's tensions. There are examples, progressive, well, not progressive, but emancipatory examples. But there are also examples that are not. So I think this film actually helps illustrate some of those tensions really well. So I'd encourage you to watch it, but also for us to bring this back to urban land. So let's try and focus in on urban land. We'll open it up again for discussion. So just hold your point. But I want to talk a bit about just explore urban land markets a little bit more. We also live in a particular period in global capitalism, right? And we hear a lot about the role that financialization is playing in land markets, particularly urban land markets. So I think it would be useful, Sean, just to hear your opinion on the manifestation of that in the South African context. You know, we've, particularly post-2008, we heard a lot about the role that the financial crisis, how closely linked that was to the housing crisis that played out in the US, but also broadly across the world. And there was a recent UN report, actually, on housing that showed the role that financialization is playing across the board. So it's a phenomenon that's having an impact on evictions, on foreclosures, on speculative land purchasing, and things like Airbnbs and short-term rentals in inner cities. So how is that playing out in the South African context? Do we have a sense of people writing about it at the moment? Sean?
Yeah, so I started graduate school in the US in the immediate fallout of the crisis, 2009, and was exposed to all of these kind of critical scholars that were digging into the increasingly close relationship between mortgage markets and capital markets through instruments like the securitized mortgage, where suddenly your mortgage is no longer about you and your relationship with your bank, but is sold off in these pools to investors and speculated upon, and very much beyond your reach and control, and the kind of absolute wasteland that rendered many first-time, largely minority buyers in the U.S. Housing markets as those subprime mortgages were called in. And I came looking for something similar in the South African housing market with these, sexy tools of critical geography that I've been exposed to in the US, and had to confront again that obduracy of context and history and specificity, and also, okay, what is useful from David Harvey and his theory of how capitalist urbanization works, and what wasn't. So for me, some of the tools that are still useful from David Harvey and his theory of capitalist urbanization in reading the South African landscape was seeing how the built environment and its finance really became an outlet for capital accumulated in other spheres. So during the commodity boom of the early 2000s, we saw credit and money just flying into gated communities, townhouse complexes, malls, to stave off crises of overproduction in other spheres, right? So that I was like, okay, I can see how that's happening. At the same time, after the crisis, we saw a lot of that capital dry up, the end of the commodity boom, and then a kind of new form of investment into property, as there's still money flying around, right? Those pension funds still have to put their investment somewhere. And we start seeing good old-fashioned land surfacing as a kind of safety deposit box from investors all over the world, looking for these new kinds of assets to offer their investors, but largely in the form of sort of new rental assets. So both office, retail, as well as housing. We see in the South African case a new institutional instrument, the Real Estate Investment Trust, appearing in 2013, which offers an avenue for this kind of global investment. And we've seen the rise of some of these domestic REITs, the Growth Point, you'll see their signs everywhere. Redefine, you'll see their signs everywhere. 10 years ago, you wouldn't have, So these are major new players reshaping urban markets, but very much towards the rental, which is something to think about critically in the housing space as we push for models beyond the ownership model. How are some of these new actors also interested in the rental space and the commodification of that? And asset streams for investors elsewhere. So in the fallout of the mortgage market in the US, you've seen a similar move into these kind of financialization of rental properties for these new instruments. But something for me that financialization and all of these new sexy instruments, the securitized mortgage, etc., didn't give me to understand in the South African case, and probably many other places, was the real grounded materiality of land sitting underneath all these markets, right? So having to grapple with what did it mean that power in, for example, the market I was studying, the affordable housing market, land and access to land was the source of power and the source of accumulation. So this market had become more active after 2008 precisely because some of these affordable developers could snap up land that suddenly bankrupt gated community developers could no longer develop. There'd been a total oversupply and the land prices dropped, and they moved in and bought up tons and tons of land. And actors like Cosmopolitan, who have been in this business just under different names since the early 90s, have been slowly building their land banks through this time, such that they now sit on something like 25,000 development opportunities.
and an incredible consolidation of land holdings, which is a very familiar story in the South African context, and it's a very racialized story. There are, basically 5 white guys controlling this market. So for me, having to confront again the landedness of housing markets was something that I was hungry for and not finding as much in the kind of US scholarship.
I mean, this question of some of the major real estate actors, so you raise that growth point as an example. I think they're an interesting case because they're not just a South African property development actor, but they're investing at the moment in Eastern Europe, in parts of Spain, I think, recently, in the rest of the continent too. They're a global player. They're the largest listed real estate trust on the Joburg Stock Exchange, but they're not just a property player in the local context. And you need to also think about the overlap with the state in this, right? Because the largest institutional investor in Growth Point is the PIC. And I think it's part of our thinking in our heads around differentiated land markets. So the land market in Rosebank, or land in Rosebank or Sandton, is naturalized. The way it's being developed is just assumed that that's the way it has to be. But shouldn't all land be viewed as political, and every brick that's laid on a piece of land be politicized? So actors like Growth Point kind of slip under the scrutiny of our land debate, for instance, at the moment. And Mandisa, this is where I kind of want to bring you in. I actually very purposefully wore this t-shirt today. There's this movement in Barcelona called La Paz, and they've been contesting foreclosures and evictions in Spain and in Barcelona. And as a movement, they've directed a lot of their protests and a lot of their public anger around the housing crisis, not only at the failed state, but at the banks. So they've occupied banks, they've had women sit in on bank foyers and refuse to move until the eviction notice that's been served by the bank to a particular family is reversed. They've raised the profile of finance capital as actors with agency within our system, right? Do you think we're doing that in our activism in South Africa? Who are we letting off the hook? Are we letting, in our public imagination, I know, white monopoly capital is a term that we are invoking in a lot of these spaces, but to what extent are we interrogating it? Do you think we are?
Who is white monopoly capital? So, I mean, it's been an interesting kind of sphere to be in, and we've always, for the longest time, targeted the government as an instrument that should be dealing with the injustices that we see in urban land ownership, injustice type of thing. And what we've done, and I think this speaks to your guys' point about the protection of property rights and what experiences have been in courts. So, rightfully so, we've targeted the government. But we have, even in targeting the government, I think we haven't really touched and made the impact that we should be making. And I'll just take one example there and then maybe explore who else we need to be looking at. In Cape Town, there's a piece of land that was occupied a couple of years ago, and it's called Marikana. It's in Philippi East. And that informal settlement is one of the most dangerous informal settlements in Cape Town. And it's one of the most underserviced communities in Cape Town as well, like any other informal settlement really. And what's interesting about that case is that we have seen, and even recently people have been evicted from that land, but there has been a court case around that, which really had a result that was in favor of the community, and where the Cape Town High Court really said to the city of Cape Town, look, you need to expropriate this land and start providing services to the people, because I mean, in most informal settlements and most occupied pieces of land, what the city of Cape Town has been saying is that, look, we can't be providing services to you, this is privately owned land. So we can't bring sanitation, we can't do any of the things that we would normally do in a community that is in the city of Cape Town. But there's a court case, there is a court ruling that says, listen, expropriate this and start developing this land for the people that stay here, so that they feel protected, so that they are part of the city, so that their dignity is protected. But we have seen the city of Cape Town appealing that judgment. And so that really doesn't make sense. So does going to court mean a victory? And sometimes what does a victory mean when you win in court? How is that victory translated into real life change or real life experiences and the transformation in those? I think in most cases that we've dealt with as the SJC, and I know Equal Education, NU, and most of the organizations we've worked with, what we have confronted as a challenge is, what do we do after the victory? And I think it's a question that we're still grappling with, to say, so when the court says this is what you should do, how do we then begin? And that has been the question. How do we mobilize and put pressure to make sure that court rulings that are viewed as victories are actually implemented into real life changes? And what we've been grappling with there as a second strand in that is how even sometimes courts do not understand the importance of people's access to urban land, access to housing, the need for people to belong in the city. And I mean, we've heard some of the most bizarre arguments in courts, like judges asking what an unemployed woman wants in the city, why do you want access to schools in town? I mean, you're not employed, how are you going to afford those things? But also in our working evictions, how courts give out eviction orders. And whether, I mean, that's lawful. If a court gives you an eviction order, then you can go and evict people because. But what does that speak to? Does that mean that the court, does that mean that that eviction is just? Is it right? Does that mean that the situations and the conditions of the people in that particular piece of land have been taken into consideration? And shouldn't we maybe be targeting the courts as well as spaces of activism and advocacy? And how do we begin to do that? How do we begin to challenge judgments, not only in the legal sense, but what political mobilization and organizing can we do in those spaces? Is there even space to actually do activism in courts? How do we put pressure on judges to actually take into consideration real life experiences of people? So there's that we're grappling with. But there's also this question of whether the state is only where we should be focusing. I think the example of Ndifuna Ukwazi and Reclaim the City there, and you would know better about that than I would, and how in the work that those guys have done, it really became obvious that, look, politicians are politicians, sometimes we'll back and will not get anywhere. But how about we actually target property owners? How do we then begin to disrupt that space and actually put pressure on those people and see what that, and I think once that was tapped into, then that's when change began to sort of come. And I think there's, in Cape Town and I think across the country, there's that relationship between property owners and politicians. And maybe in the country that speaks to tenders and blah, 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 blah. But in Cape Town, that could also speak to approval of things when a development or a developer wants to build this. How that is not scrutinized to take into consideration social housing, to take into consideration affordable housing in the inner city. So how that relationship we haven't really explored to say why are property rights protected over normal people, ordinary people's rights to housing, to dignity, to all of those things. So I think there's a space to actually make property owners, private developers uncomfortable as well. We've made the government uncomfortable, and I think to an extent they are sort of desensitized to our noise, but the people that still need to make money and still need to appear as these growing progressive businesses are private property owners, and I don't think we have really annoyed them enough, for a lack of a better word, to actually make them uncomfortable and make sure that the space there for engagement. And I think maybe in our thinking and rethinking the cities and how inclusive their economies are, maybe we need to think about the private property developers and how we make those guys uncomfortable, and how we open up that space as a space for activism, as a space for engagement, and how we include everyone, the ordinary citizens and the excluded people in the informal segments and townships and all of that.
I think just to kind of pick up on that quickly, I think that is, so I don't know if people have heard about this campaign for inclusionary housing as a concept, right? So it's this idea that for every market rate housing development that goes up, there should be, ideally within that same development or elsewhere nearby in the same area, affordable housing built by the property developer in question. So it's a mandatory policy. And there's many cities in the world that have this. For instance, New York is the best example. Vancouver, there's cities in India that have this. And there's been a recent attempt, driven particularly by Difunogwazi in Cape Town. Every time a developer puts forward an application for a private development, whether it's a fancy luxury apartment in the inner city or a gated community in the burbs on the outskirts, that they've challenged that on the basis that that development needs to include affordable housing. And they faced a major pushback from developers. But the developers are now putting pressure on the city, saying that if you mandate us to build affordable housing, we will leave. We won't develop in your city anymore. And I just quickly have a little anecdote to share with you before we start talking about next steps. About a month ago, these really progressive planners in the city of Joburg put forward an inclusionary housing policy. They put it up for public comment. And the policy would mandate developers who develop over, I think it was 15 units of housing, to include a percentage of affordable housing in their developments. So this was a draft policy that they then put out for comment. And usually like planning policies, people don't really pay attention to them. They like to go under the radar. So a month afterwards, they held their meeting, a feedback meeting. The response was so big, they had to move the meeting to the old Joburg council chambers to have the feedback meeting. So I go to this meeting, it's a huge hall, packed to the brim. Predominantly, I would say like 90% white men in the room, developers. Most of them were developers. And people were furious. They were furious about this idea that developers should be mandated by the state to include affordable housing. Like, how can you disrupt the natural of the market, right? You can't intervene. This is just how things are supposed to be. This is, there were some very, very angry people saying, this is social engineering of another kind. Like, what are we trying to do to our cities? And in the end, the Joburg planners they shifted the policy. So it's no longer mandatory to include affordable housing. They put a few other options. You can build smaller housing, or they basically changed it so that it's not compulsory, right? But these planners are really progressive. They're young. They had really good intentions. They weren't bribed by the property developers. They weren't like held at gunpoint, but they changed a policy that could have potentially have been shifted the geography of Joburg. And also the threat that they were given there was that developers just won't develop in the city, so you can't put forward a policy like this. So, then now what? That's the question. Where do we go from here, right? It's not always that the state is kind of conceding to capital, and there are attempts. When there are progressive attempts, the status quo still seems to unfold. So knowing what we do about what's currently happening, what the dominant discourse is around land at the moment, around orthodox economic positions around what land values and land markets, what we also know in terms of the state's position often when it comes to land, and fears around disrupting private property rights or intervening in the property markets. Knowing too that the actors aren't just government actors, but like we said, people like Growth Point, the role of major banks in the South African context, people, institutions like RMB and Old Mutual, who also own extensive amounts of land. Knowing the actors, knowing the power of the ideology, and knowing the kind of daily realities, what we're seeing right now, what next? Where should we be directing our energy as activists, as researchers, as upcoming academics, as people who are fighting for land justice, or thinking about how, theories of better economic theories, more progressive economic theories, what should we be doing next? I know it's a big question, but from your perspective, where should we be going? So we each bring our own journeys and our own expertise and our own ideas. So I think maybe to hear from you, Mandisa, and then Sean, and then we can open it up.
Well, that is like the most difficult question. So I work in the mobilizing, organizing space, and my background is politics. So I guess my answer would lean towards that, to say, so whether it's the government or private property owners, no one wants to look bad. No one wants to look like the villain. Everyone wants to look like we are all human, we are all equal, and let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And everyone wants to appear as this progressive, human rights respecting person. And the worst thing to happen to the image of a company or a government institution is having a political campaign led by the people on the ground against you. Whether you're a bank, to have a community. Okay, let's go back to the example of Marikana. Let's find out who owns that land, for example. And that's where research comes in to say, so let's follow the money. Who owns this land? And let's target that person. Whether it's a bank or a company, we've been marching, we've been making noise against the government, but let's target the private people who are safe. We never know. It's always like, oh no, this is private land, it's privately owned, and we never know who owns the land. Maybe that's who we need to find out, to say who owns this land and where are they. And maybe what we need to start doing is to mobilize and organize political campaigns led by the people that are evicted in these areas to say, you are not using this land. And there are people staying in this land, and the government is protecting you, so we're appealing to you. If you're a person as a person, if you're an institution as an institution, to say the dignity and the rights of people staying in informal settlements. And maybe let's not even say just people staying in informal settlements. Let's name it as it is and say the dignity of black marginalized people in South Africa needs to be respected, it needs to count. And if we are going to challenge people only in courtrooms and in boardrooms, that's where it's going to end, right? But when we shine a light to say there are people in Msindweni, in Makaza, that are being evicted from a piece of land without any alternative place to go to, and this is the person that owns this land, and this person hasn't been using this land for the past 30 years. And that speaks to the injustice of it, and that puts a face to the injustice, to say, this is the company or this is the person that is actually evicting these people. And I think linked to that for me is the courts that continue to give these eviction orders to say people must be moved from their homes and taken to wherever. And we need to target the courts as well and say, why are courts just dishing out eviction orders without considering where people should be staying, without considering the conditions of people staying in these pieces of land? Because, I mean, if you have an eviction order from the court, like I've already said, then it's legal for you, it's legal for you to actually evict these people. But how just is it? How humane is it? And we need to actually challenge those people, those untouched areas of that all contribute to this issue of landlessness and cities and urban areas being so exclusive. So I think directing our activism and directing our mobilization and political campaigns to people that actually own the land, and maybe having a conversation with those people to say, so let's reach an agreement. How do we make sure that we are protected, but how do we make sure that you get what you want as well? Let's have a conversation. But also the courts need to be touched as well. I feel that we leave courts untouched and they can dish out all these rulings that sometimes are oppressive to people. So I think for me those two strands needs to be sort of shaken a bit.
So one other side of activism, I think we've already mentioned the PIC briefly, but what would it mean to think about shaking up how pension funds see good investments, especially those that we can talk to in terms of their members, so the government employees pension fund. Obviously the PIC has been dealing with its own crises lately, but something to kind of keep on the horizon in terms of shareholder activism is, for example, Growth Point, what we want to be putting our workers' pension funds into, is SA home loans, what we want, the financial institution we want to be supporting that has a securitized mortgage model. And that, I guess, is part of raising awareness within those constituents. What next? I think within the university, as the community that I'm part of, thinking about denormalizing the kind of mainstream model of property and agglomeration economics as the kind of only game in town for land development, whether it's in our planning curricula, whether it's in our building a heterodox economics curricula, and thinking about what are some of the instruments out there, for example, that the state can use to incentivize, negotiate, bargain. I know some Neil Klug is doing his PhD into some of these instruments that the city could be using more actively to shape how development happens for who, and that we've seen some experiments with from the inclusionary housing guys. And then I think in terms of the research space, I think there's a lot more work to be done on the operations and calculations of these mid-level institutional actors, financial institutions, developers, REITs, and I'm not talking about big systemic analyses. I think we have a lot of that work, but in terms of finding points of leverage in mobilizing in the ways Mandisa was talking about, how might our research in those hidden abodes of power at the kind of firm level, what might we learn there about how to mobilize? For example, someone looking at what goes into your credit risk assessments. What are all the proxies that go into that determine whether you are credit worthy or not? And some highly problematic assumptions, for example, whether you have a landline or not, means you are more or less risky. So what does that have to do with connecting to historical legacies of who was provisioned with landlines and where, you know? And there are actually some bankers who are fighting within their own credit committees to change these because they know it's bad for business. So thinking about what are some of those sites of leverage we could explore as researchers.
So part of the masters that brings me here, right, is around the legal aspect, right? I think what we've been seeing a lot is the meaningful engagement the courts ask for, especially in I think we saw this with Olivia Rowe, we saw this with Joe Slovo, that the court will then say that the government must go meaningfully engage with the community. But I think we all understand that the power dynamics in these engagements are off. One of the questions I have two. The one question is around the idea of, and it's a reflection when it comes in the form of the question, right? Around what meaningful engagement looks like with private individuals, right, or institutions. So when the court, I think what we often see, the court says evict, right, because the court finds itself in a difficult position to say that the community must go engage with an individual or a company, right? And so I think part of it has got, and the legal part of this conversation we're having is an important one, is whether or not the parameters or scope is there in the laws of the Constitution itself as we see it now, or in the way we choose to interpret these laws and the Constitution. Just quick reflect on what you're saying as well, is I agree that the court ought to be a space of contestation. I'm slightly uncomfortable, however, with the idea of the court being a space of protest as well. Sure. Especially when we understand that those who are on the other side of this have got deeper pockets than us, right? And that if we're then contesting and protesting in this courtroom, in the space that ought to be independent, so I want to fully agree, and also I'm intentional. And the one other part that I'm interested in as well is so there's an interesting development in East London. I think it's the New Cove development. So the occupiers over there, who then, after discussing with Rob Pollock, I think his name is, decide to buy the piece of land from him for 17 million rand. So I think they're in a crowdfunding process at the moment. So again, so the idea of the legal part of it with the global capitalist system that sits here, right? When we're thinking about the idea of, especially in urban land, right? When we go to a piece of land, and we want this piece of land, and then this person says, I'm happy to sell it to you, right? How are we thinking about this, right? Especially, we find a thought around this is when this big drive you see from the DeSotos, right? And I think it isn't by chance that SA, I think F4 and the DA are big proponents and drivers of title deeds. Right? And I think there's something there that we shouldn't get caught up in this. We should all have title deeds, and it sounds great.
Thank you. Others? Yeah.
Okay, I'm from Durban, and so I work for the devil, which is perpetuity in Durban. So,
Perpetuity in Durban.
Perpetuity, yes. And so I've been part of a local, I've crafted the local area plan for Durban, which aims to get 450 people living in an inner city by 2030. Currently, there's like 70 to 80 people living in the city. So, through that experience, I was pushing a more very socialist understanding within perpetuity. But what I found is that the government wasn't an enabler in meeting the private developer where it's at. So you look at how there's huge budgets for social housing, but all of those budgets are not touched because the government can't be an enabler of purchasing the land and also policy becoming very rigid to move around. So I've even done calculations on, we've done calculations seeing if it's worthy for private developers to pursue affordable housing, gap housing. It doesn't make sense for them. So I don't think it's a very viable option to go to property developers, but how does government become an enabler and claim space? I don't think you can go to France and dictate the spatial orientation of France. Why are we allowing capital to dictate our orientation? Why is government not putting the stand of inclusionary housing as it's in policy? With all these policies which are they're just there, but we don't get to interact with them in a very meaningful way. And part of understanding protest is very necessary, but how do we get to a point where we engage and we look at models? Because in Cape Town it has happened that there are social housing projects that have been successful with different ones. I've seen the work that they're doing. How do we look at the positives and try to replicate those models? What models have you guys seen for social housing that has worked? In parts of Latin America, it's been a thing that it's more and more embraced internationally, also locally. And Cape Town has that. What positives can we see in our country that we can speak about today and see how we can replicate those models? So that's a question I would love to pose.
There were a few hands. I'm going to take people who haven't spoken yet. Have you spoken before? Okay, so you, and then the two people who've spoken already, yes.
I want to speak to Mandisa. I think, sorry first for my language, because it's not my native. So I want you to be patient with me. Actually, I have to speak in the beginning of the lecture about many issues, but I think you are mixing a lot of concepts, a lot of basic concepts. Yes, the government should provide service, but there is no relation between providing the service and own the land. In my country, we have lands on the borders. These lands are not for owning it. It's a governmental land, but service should be provided to the people living there. So it doesn't mean, so it's a failure in the government in your country, but there is no relation between providing services, public services, and owning the land. Second, you are mixing between the three powers, basic political, basic concepts in political science. We have three powers. Judiciary, they give orders, but the one who executes the orders is the government. And you cannot say that I don't like the judiciary orders, so please don't interfere. The difference between developing countries and developed ones is that they are respecting the rule of law. Now we are diminishing, you want to diminish the law because you have your own problem. No, it's not right. Third issue, justice should be for all, for men, for women, for white and for black. It's not, I'm sorry, it's if it, and you said that there is an unoccupied land in Cape Town, and the ladies are having houses there because they don't have, whatever reasons they have. We have to also distinguish between the rule of the government is to protect other people's also rights. Yes, this lady make a bad choice, and now she don't have a place to live. But does it mean that to take a public property, that this non-occupied land is a public property, it belongs to the whole South Africa? Why the lady you are speaking about should take it? Not anybody here, not any other people in Cape Town. Yes, you have a right, you have a constitutional right, but you cannot say because I don't have it, I have to occupy any land and it's mine. No. Basic principle in political science, we create the government to protect us. So what the government did, it's not a violence. Government use the violence because we are attacking other people's rights. This land is a public property, not for anybody. So you cannot say that please let the lady take the land and now the government are doing violence. No. And when she takes the land, so please return back the government again to the picture to protect this lady. No, it's not right. Protection should be for all, for men, for women, even for white. And I think, I'm sorry to say, you are speaking more about sentiment. You are more about people who, political people who, politicians who speak for streets, but not who govern, who occupy the government. If you want to achieve long-lasting peace and justice, you have to provide alternatives, long-lasting alternatives for both, for white and for also for black. Yes, I know that they have how to say, you are not, South Africa is not the only country suffer from colonial power. All of the African, surprisingly, all the African countries have the same history. And I think you have to compare your story about land with other countries and what they did when they redistribute the land. And you have to see, when the policy of redistribution, did they achieve good impact or bad impact? Maybe the problem is not redistribution. You have also to provide certain rules for using the land. For example, in my country, we have the same problem like South Africa. We redistributed the land. What did the people do? They didn't use it positively. Actually, it became worse than the colonial power. So the problem is not redistribution. The problem is how to put certain rules and to monitor it and to be sure that this land are used in a proper way, but not to just we are speaking. I'm not saying this to you, but I think it's a time for the South African people not to think like black and white. No, I think when you are defending a citizenship, you are defending a South African, not a black South African, not a white South African. That is what I learned about citizenship. We are all one. We are fighting the same rules. So I'm fighting the same battle. So maybe it's a time to not to abuse the history.
Okay, can I ask 2 more points? I don't actually know if we're going to get a chance to address them because I just saw that it's 10:30. But let's hear from you and then, okay, yes. Oh, you, wait, sorry, him first, sorry.
Sorry, just 2 quick questions. One, in terms of a local context, are there any examples of progressive municipalities, provincial governments that have effectively had urban housing programs, low-cost housing programs that we as researchers can study and use as examples? And the other question is, what are your thoughts on land value tax as a means to stop speculative property development and to redistribute the gains from land to people who don't have them?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think, where we are in this country, it's at a place where I can say the chickens have come home to roost. Yes. It's a matter of what we did not do or what we did in '94. It's we are now having to grapple with that, and we are now having to try to put out small fires because of the bigger fire that we ignored or we kept under the carpet, thinking that it's just going to go away. South Africa is the only place, I think, I don't know any other place where we can believe and accept that a prisoner can negotiate with his captors and come out as a winner. It just does not make sense. If you are a prisoner, you will accept whatever they say just to get out of prison. But if we now glorify Nelson Mandela as a god, the challenge with that is that you can't criticize him. You can't review the things he did or did not do. The land debate in South Africa is not a new one. It dates back 1913 when Sol Plaatje wrote Native Life in South Africa. It goes back in the 60s when the Pan-African Congress, the PAC, broke out of the ANC because the ANC had adopted the Freedom Charter. So now you have, in 94, when now property rights, where white people have been accumulating land for so many years, and in 94, you put in the constitution that no one can be deprived of their land. Do you see how that doesn't make any sense, right? So when the courts decide for the private propertiers, they're doing what the constitution says, that no one can be deprived of their property rights. They now have to decide between human rights and now property rights. And property rights always win over human rights. Right? Now, in the other debate, the land debate, where Ruth Hall is speaking, now I've read Ruth Hall, some of the things. Now, what Ruth Hall will say is that in the land debate today, you don't need to change the constitution in order to expropriate land. That's what she said. Because the government has had policies in order to redistribute land. It's just that there's not been any political will over the years. And now that the EFF is bringing up the conversation, now there is political will. But yet again, it does not make sense now to say you have to expect the government, which only earns its revenue through taxes, to do everything that it has to do. I don't know the statistics, but in my estimation, the government might just be the biggest employer in the country. So most of what the government takes in, it has to go through wages and all of these services it brings. And now you still expect it to buy land that was taken. So what we did not do in '94 is talk about how the land needs to be repossessed instead of expropriated. Because if you say expropriation, now you bring in the law, you bring in the constitution, whereas it was taken away in a manner that was not lawful. And now you must now take it back in a lawful monetary way. And that's a conversation that we evaded in '94, and now it's coming back to bite us.
Last point.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I think there's a question mark around government ownership of land. And what I'm saying, I'm not going to talk about ownership of management. The government, being between the municipalities and the provincial departments, own a lot of urban land. And I think one of the things that we are not holding them accountable for is the management of that land. And I think the city of Joburg story that happened 2 days ago, the burning of the building, is a typical example. And it's actually much more widespread than we realize. And I'm talking about, if we go to every major city, the government at least owns a third of the buildings in that area. And that's just talking about the urban land itself. And the misuse in terms of administration, in terms of collection of rent, etc. They rent a lot of buildings. And the question mark is that renting actually good for the administration? And when they do so, are they looking after the area around them? So if we look at the city centre in Joburg or Durban and East London for that matter, the area around the building is not maintained and taken care of. So it lands up in decay, and then it makes it less attractive for investment in terms of building houses or office space or business space, etc. So I think that really needs to be questioned. I think there's also a part where government is not, it's from a service delivery point of view, we're not taking development along with our services. So we've got major developments, for instance, in the East Rand at the moment from a housing point of view. But the water, the power, the sewage is not being capacitated in a manner
that allows us to continue the development. So even that, the lifespan of that is going to be a problem.
Okay, so 2 minutes. Sorry, guys. We did start late, so it is a bit unfair, but let's try. I mean, there were a lot of things raised. There's people here that you'll see over the next few days you can have conversations with, but the most pressing things that you'd like to respond to.
Okay, let me first, and I'll say just one thing that I think, and I'll speak to the lady over here. So I think you're making a couple of assumptions, and one is that everyone in South Africa experiences citizenship the same way. That when we speak about democracy and the rule of law, and you are again assuming that everyone in South Africa experiences those the same way. And taking into consideration the history of South Africa, you know that black and white in South Africa speaks to how you experience either citizenship or democracy or whatever, or access to whatever. And I think those assumptions are at the heart of what we're grappling with, or the problem that we see ourselves having to deal with today. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks for the great questions. Just maybe some interesting things to read about some of the what now questions. Community land trusts, I think, are an interesting model that somewhere like the New Cove community could use for taking property outside of speculative forms of investment and individual ownership. There's lots of experiments in the US with community land trusts. In terms of land value tax, absolutely, that's one of those instruments I'm thinking we can play with more, and thinking about the state as a property actor. There's amazing work on Singapore as a so-called property state that has these land institutions that work across the silos that we know make it so difficult for the city and province or departments within the city to manage projects. So Anne Haila has done amazing work on Singapore as a property state and these institutions that I think we can learn from. And interesting examples, I mean, for me, the tendency towards the mega is what we need to always work against. And what does it mean to have smaller experiments in places, for example, like the Brickfields housing project, although I think that should be kept out of the private market. So what are some of those small pockets of experimentation that we can learn from that? Those are my two leads, I guess.
Okay, I think we'll end it there because we're being evicted. So thank you, everyone.